I got the beard for it, too. All right, folks. Well, welcome to BSides, Toronto, 2018. This has been quite a journey. I'm one of the co-founders of this event, but I am definitely not the one doing the work. If you see people with orange shirts here, please thank them for all of their hard work. I am not one of those people. They just put up with me these days. So, a couple of housekeeping items before we get rolling here. Number one, Dr. Jones, are you here? There he is. So Dan Jones will be taking photos for us for the event. If you do not want your picture taken, please either let him know or somebody in an orange shirt so that we make sure that we don't expose you to the wider universe. All right, a few other things. Where are the bathrooms? If you need to, they're out that door. That's the easiest one. There's also a couple of onesie-twosies out that way as well. Please clean up after yourself. We're not your parents. I have enough trouble with my own kids. I don't need to take after you guys too. Lunch will be downstairs. Whereabouts downstairs? Oh, down the stairs. Okay, so lunch will be down the stairs. We have to be sure that we understand that there are other events that will be happening here, so please make sure that you are courteous with them as well, because we are not the only show in town, and we have to be very aware of these things. What other things do we have to do here? Well, none of this would be possible without our sponsors. And we'd like to say thank you to our sponsors, and we'd like to invite up Dinesh. Where are you? Oh, you're over there now. And Dinesh will be saying a couple words.
Hey guys, so I work for Security Innovations. We came in last year and we saw the crowd here. I think it was the first BSides event last year. The fifth, sorry. So it was pretty fun. It was the first time we came to the event. It was pretty fun, and my whole team was like, yeah, we should do it again. So we are running a Capture the Flag event in ENG 102. How many of you guys have ever played a Capture the Flag event? A lot of you guys. So I'll be seeing a lot of you guys over there. So a quick intro of what the event is. So you might, all of you use Amazon or any e-commerce websites, right? So we would always want to see like what kind of attacks are possible, or how can you break into them. So legally, of course, you cannot do it on the real world websites. So we are running Shred. So think of Shred as a totally vulnerable, totally insecure e-commerce application. You can break into it, and unlike the typical CTF applications where you get a flag, here you do not have to worry about a flag. Every time, let's say you get an XSS, you get a point. Depending upon the type of XSS you find, you'll get more points. Let's say you drop a database, you get even more points. So you don't have to worry about the traditional flags. So I'll see you guys in ENG 102, and thank you. It's fun to be here.
Thank you very much. To be fair, the first couple of iterations of BSides Toronto were in a bar, so I can understand why that might not be of something that somebody would remember. All right, so this year we're doing the charitable thing again. We are actually raising funds for CAMH, and we're going to be doing that in giving away a couple of sector passes for this, one for this year and one for next year. So that will be happening today. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Sector tickets will be on auction before lunchtime. And when we did this in the past, that number went up pretty fast. So be prepared to go to the mat on this one. Right. Now, so another thing that I've seen at a lot of conferences, and we haven't done it in the same vein, but we want to put it this way. If you are hiring, you want to put up your hand right now? All right, for those of you looking for jobs, go meet these people. There are name tags here for a reason, mainly because I was too lazy to stuff all these badges myself, so I did that. But case in point, you don't have to put your name on here, but if you do, it just makes it, this is your community. You don't take the time to meet everybody. That's a really good idea in that respect. So they got the hiring thing. Also, we are going to be doing something called kindling that you're going to see in our list of things to do, and that is an idea that was put forward where that if you are working on a project or working on some sort of event or something along the lines where you need help, we're going to ask people to bring up these ideas. So if you have that idea and you want to talk about it, and during the King Link sessions, we'll say, look, what's your idea? Put it up, and then you started that discussion for that little period of time. So keep that in mind as we're going forward. Now, in addition, before I get too far down the road here, the other sponsors I would like to thank very much are Palo Alto Networks, Proofpoint, who is going to be doing our lunch today, Fortinet, and I apologize if I get this name wrong, Secura, Zscaler, and Logarithms. And as well, we have the Kali Linux training from Offensive Security, and thanks to our folks at Sector and, of course, Security Innovation. And now, the last thing I want to say before I turn it over, we have a code of conduct. Please do not act presidential. I think I made my point. Now I'd like to introduce our presenting sponsor, Palo Alto, and is somebody coming up? We're here. Ah, there we are. Excellent. Well, please welcome Palo Alto to the stage.
Thank you. Might as well come on up, Josh. So yeah, thanks again, everybody, for coming out. This is a great event. My name is Stephen Prisbali. I'm with Palo Alto Networks, and this is Josh with me here. Rather than taking up our kind of sponsory part of this talk, I want to give all the time to Josh here. Josh works with the product of our products. So Palo Alto Networks is one of the biggest cybersecurity companies on the planet today. And what Josh does is he's on a team of threat researchers called Unit 42. These guys do not play with firewalls. They do not play with endpoint protection. What they play with is the threat intelligence data that is generated by all of these sensors that are all over the planet. And so this is very agnostic threat research. And with that, I just want to hand it right over to Josh.
Thanks, Stephen. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me on this surprisingly beautiful Saturday morning here in Toronto. Yeah, this is actually a really cool venue. I feel a bit like a college professor right now. But yeah, like Dave was saying, there's random ferns too, so, you know, I love it. So by way of introduction, my name is Josh Grunzweig. I reverse malware, been doing it for about 10 years now. I script in Python, and I tend to write a lot of blogs. I mean, honestly, if you were to distill my professional career, those 3 bullets pretty much cover it. So today we're going to be talking about a group called the Gorgon Group. For those that might not be familiar with the term, it is a number of individuals that we believe to be residing in or around Pakistan that conduct both targeted attacks against foreign and domestic government entities, and also simultaneously conduct more widespread cybercrime attacks, so basically trying to pay the bills. So today I'm going to be covering a few things. I'm basically going to walk you guys through how I discovered this group originally, all the way up until the expanded research that leads us into what we know today. We're going to talk a bit about the tools and the tactics that these guys use to conduct their attacks, and also, you know, talk a little bit about attribution. I know I'm being recorded, so I'm going to skirt the line, as it were, and try not to get myself in too much trouble. So it all started about a year ago, a little over a year ago. I found myself sitting at my desk at my home, as I do, looking at sort of what was going on for that day, seeing if there's anything interesting that caught my eye. And what I discovered was this series of targeted email attacks against a US government individual, or a series of individuals, that were actually based over in New Delhi, India. So on the surface, they really didn't look all that special. I mean, sure, it was low volume, but what we were seeing was really generic, innocuous file names for the email attachments. We were seeing generic subject lines. And the email sender, in this case, was a likely compromised Indian Yahoo email account. So that by itself really didn't catch my eye that much. But what did catch my eye was the malware being used. So with all these attacks, it distilled down to 3 unique malware samples. There was 2 RTFs that acted as simple downloaders, dropping a malware family called Kasar Rat. That is not a special piece of malware by any means. It's commodity. It's easy to obtain. Probably costs like 40 or 50 bucks. But the third one, the Excel document, was a copy of the Crimson Rat malware family. Now, for those that aren't familiar, Crimson Rat is a very low-volume malware family, almost exclusively used in targeted attacks. It has overlap with other research, including Transparent Tribe, by Proofpoint, actually, who's in the audience somewhere, as well as Operation C Major, which was research done by Trend Micro, who may or may not be here today, I'm not sure. So this, of course, caught my attention. You know, I'm thinking to myself, well, on the surface, it didn't look all that exciting, but I should probably dig in a bit further. So, of course, I jumped into the Crimson Rat stuff first. It actually proved to be totally boring. There wasn't too much there. It used C2 servers that were well known. It was overlapping with previous research that had been done, pointed to some German VPS. Nothing super exciting there. Really, the only exciting thing might have been how it delivered the payload. It just simply had this embedded Excel form with 3 text boxes that had, I guess you'd call it ordinal encoded binary. So it would take each number, comma separated, convert it to its binary representation, concatenate it all together, and it had a binary, it had an executable, which it would then in turn run and do its thing. So I was a little discouraged, thought to myself, this is probably a dead end. I probably just wasted a good chunk of my morning, but I kept going. I decided, I might as well look at everything. So I jumped over to the RTFs. Now these guys were not special. They used an incredibly old CVE, 2012-0158. I'm sure a lot of folks in the room are familiar with it because for some unknown reason, it still works. Just a simple shellcode downloader under the hood, and it pointed to this subat.com/files/sp.exe executable. And as I said earlier, the payload was Kasar Rat. So again, nothing super exciting here, but this particular side of things did leave me with a couple of network-based artifacts that I decided to jump into further. We had an IP address that was the C2 for Kasar Rat. And then, of course, we had the subat.com domain, which was hosting the malware itself. Excuse me, I've been fighting a cold all week, so you have to forgive me. So I jumped at the IP address first and decided to jump into a third-party tool that we always find ourselves using, and that is called Passive Total. Looked at the whois for this guy, and what I found was potentially interesting. It was a ISP located over in Pakistan, over in Islamabad. But yeah, it was an ISP. It was probably an ISP not that dissimilar from Comcast down in the States. They cater a lot to residential homes, a little bit to businesses, but primarily residential homes are their sort of bread and butter. When you navigate to this IP address on port 80, you're actually presented with a web front end to a home, well, let's say consumer-grade gigabit router, which adds some interesting evidence to the fact that we know that this is a ISP that caters to residential homes. Now, normally, C2 servers are some random VPS. There's something very obscure. It might be a compromised organization. But here we have evidence pointing to the fact that it might actually belong to the attacker's home IP. So that was interesting. Kind of tucked that away in my back pocket, held on to it. And I moved over to Subat. Now, if you were to look at subat.com, the current whois is protected. It's all but, unusable. You can't really do much with it. But again, using Passive Total, if you were to look at the historical whois, you'll notice that there's some interesting information displayed. Specifically, we get an email address of smsallteam@gmail.com, and further, evidence pointing to the Pakistan region. In this particular case, it is pointing to Hyderabad, Pakistan. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing these regional names. It's not something I'm as familiar with as I should be. So I took that email address and I pivoted further. I decided to see what other domains have been registered using that email, and I found 17 additional domains. Now, it's probably hard to see because it's a bit small on the screen there, but essentially we're seeing a series of domains that reference both the Pakistan region as well as Arabic words. So we see stuff like Yasir and Kamar. We see Multan. In the case of multanmail.com, Multan is actually a city in Pakistan. But then we also see some interesting stuff at the bottom, like full crack zone and freeware softs and so on and so forth. So stuff that would indicate that this individual was kind of dabbling in password or application cracking, software cracking, some of that, stuff that we would probably tie to more script kiddie activity. So I decided to take those 17 domains, look historically at their whois, and I saw a lot of interesting stuff. I saw a number of domains that had been registered simply by the name Umar. Similar information to this, but then I found one, and I forget which one it was, but I found one domain that historically had this information here, and it had a email registrant, again, as smslteam@gmail.com. It had a registrant name of Umar Subat, location, a Army aviation base in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. So even though I'm up here in an academic stage, you don't need to really be a PhD to make the correlation between Subat.com and Umar Subat. There's somewhat of an obvious correlation there. So I felt pretty good at this point. I'm thinking to myself, okay, I've got a name that I have reasonable certainty that likely owns this domain. But so what? Does that mean that this domain was created for the sole intent of malicious activity? Because more often than not, we'll see instances where domains are simply compromised. They're running web servers with outdated software, they get compromised, people throw their malware up there and host it. It's not unusual. So I decided to look at Subat.com, just over HTTP, and I found, A, there was no actual website there. It was just essentially a file repository. And B, it had about 80 or 90 unique malware samples hosted on it. All open directory. That'll be a recurring theme of today. These guys are really bad at configuring Apache, apparently, because it's always open directory, which is great for me. I'm not complaining. But yeah, I'm a malware guy, so I was like super excited to see all this malware that I could kind of dig into and have some fun with. So I spent some time, and I decided to cluster it into various malware groups and CVs and so on and so forth. And there's a few, I guess, key takeaways. Of course, Kasar Rat, which was the file originally found hosted here, we see a number of samples related to that, 11 in total. We also actually see that same Crimson Rat downloader sample hosted here as well. Now, we'd never seen any inference or any indication that this sample had any direct ties to this domain prior, but here we see it actually hosted here, which was pretty interesting. What caught my eye personally was this large cluster of Luminosity Link. So for those that don't know, Luminosity Link, it's again Commodity Rat. It's been out for a few years now. I think they actually just arrested the guy behind it, some random guy down in Kentucky in the United States. But I found myself a couple years back doing a lot of research on this malware family. I don't know why, I just randomly found myself gravitating towards it, and I spent, probably a week or two fully understanding how this malware worked. And the way it works is you buy it, it's like $40, or it was back when it was still being sold, and you register it with an email address, and then you're able to create new samples. And each sample has a configuration associated with it. That configuration is encrypted and embedded in each sample. So I had spent a little while understanding how to decrypt and parse that config, and I basically looked at 15,000 samples and pulled out the configs and just dumped all that info on GitHub so that people like yourselves could better protect and defend yourselves against this threat. But that was great because I still had those scripts. And so I decided to run them against those 20 samples, and I found that they all had identical configs. They're all the exact same. What really caught my eye, though, was the C2 domain, which was a DNS server, or a DNS host, just a dynamic DNS, if I remember correctly. Had some interesting words in it. It had USA, it had UAE, or United Arab Emirates. It had the word Hassan. Speculation here, it might have been related to the president of Iran, not sure. But more importantly, it resolved to an IP address that should look familiar. And that is the exact same IP address that we saw earlier, hosting that gigabit home, consumer-grade router. So here we've got malware hosted on Subot.com, pointing again to that same IP. What also was cool is that, again, we had the email address that was used to register this malware when it was purchased. It, for those that can't see, says karam.rizvi@hotmail.com. And so I, having numerous years of experience, decided to leverage, all of my expertise, and so I decided to Google it. And what I found was a single post on hackingforums.com, a response, actually. It technically wasn't a post, but a response on a thread about a Office exploit builder. And here's a user named Subot basically saying, hey, I purchased this thing, I'm having some trouble with it. My registrant email is, again, that karamrizvi@hotmail.com. So I was like, that's kind of neat, because here we have another instance of the name Subot, and here we have it tying directly to malicious activity. So at this point, my thought of this being just a situation where the guy got compromised has all but disappeared. I'm pretty sure this guy is just a bad guy who is likely behind these attacks. So I looked at his post history, and one detail I hadn't mentioned until now was that the original attack took place at the end of July 2017. And if you were to actually read the timestamps on the right, you'll see he posted about 12 times in his lifetime on this forum. He posted once in late 2016, and then he just went dark. He went quiet. And he didn't really kick off or start up again until the beginning of July 2017, at which point he starts asking and purchasing exploit builders and malicious Office macro builders and cryptors and that whole sort of thing. And it leads right up until essentially that attack. So that was really quite fascinating. I felt pretty good at this point. I felt like I had really come full circle with this research. I had essentially started with some fairly innocuous-looking targeted attacks against US government entities, pivoted in a number of ways to ultimately determine who I felt was the individual behind these attacks. So I felt good. I felt like we had really come to a good conclusion with this research. Passed along the information to the necessary authorities, ultimately ended up blogging about it, and kind of just continued on with my day-to-day work. And so it really felt like the end of the story. But in the months afterwards, certain developments took place. Myself and other coworkers found ourselves discovering more C2 servers, more malware hosting servers that we ultimately clustered in this same grouping of activity. So all of a sudden, we got to the point where I was thinking, it can't all be this Umar Subot guy, right? Because we're starting to see more names, more relationships, and it got to the point where we really just thought to ourselves, okay, this feels more like a group, like there's multiple people involved. And so we expanded our research. And I do want to point out, because my coworkers made fun of me, that is a worm, like crawling along. I don't want to see social media posts later about how Josh Grunzweig has inappropriate icons in his PowerPoint. So that is a worm, just to make that clear. So we found more stuff. We kept seeing more malware hosting repositories. And again, as I said earlier, they were always open directory listings. Other attributes that we continued to find were these doc and exe subdirectories, these folders, as well as VBS scripts that were just always present. So we just see that time and time again. This particular instance is actually not that long ago. It's from June of this year. Same deal, June of this year, also June of this year. I did a lot of research in June, April in this case. But you see the same repetitive attributes. We also oftentimes see this work directory involved as well. You'll see at the top the parent directory is work. And sometimes they mix it up. In this case, it's doc, but also like doc new, exe, new exe. I mean, but generally, you get the gist. So when it was all said and done, we'd had identified 24 domains that we tied to this group of activity. And the other interesting thing that we found was the majority of the malware they used leveraged Bitly. It leveraged the Bitly URL shortening service. So Bitly is not a malicious service. I want to make that clear. We work with the security team very frequently. They're great. They're very responsive. They take this stuff down as soon as we ask them to. But like many services out there, it gets abused. It gets treated maliciously. And so we started to find that a lot of the samples had Bitly domains. You'll see the word load or loading frequently used. And I'm not sure if these guys thought that helped them hide. Like oh, some sysadmins like, oh, here's an Office doc running a macro that's downloading a file from Bitly. Oh, but it says loading, please wait. So like, it's okay. It was oftentimes misspelled too. But there was a lot, about 130 when it was all said and done. And I'm not going to wait because I don't have all day. But yeah, when it was all said and done, we'd identified about 1,200 unique malware samples, 24 domains, encompassing about 90,000 unique attacks based on our telemetry. And as I kind of said in the very beginning, these guys dabble both in targeted attacks as well as just generic commodity attacks. So let's break that up a little bit. Let's just focus on the commodity attacks themselves. The malware is nothing special. I'll be blunt. It's readily available commodity malware that you can buy on most underground forums for less than $100. In most cases, there's cracked versions that may or may not be backdoored that you can get for free. So in this case, we saw a lot of what has already been discussed. We see LokiBot, Remcos, Luminosity Link, so on and so forth. Nothing terribly special. On the telemetry side, I'd mentioned that Bitly was used. Now, Bitly is great. For those that don't know, the not-so-secret about a lot of these URL shortening services is that you can typically add a character to the end of the URL and get anonymous telemetry on who clicked it. So in Bitly's case, if you had a plus sign to the URL and you have an account, you get something like this. You get a historical timeline of when the link was viewed. In some cases, you get the referring application, whether it was email or Yahoo or YouTube or whatever the case may be, and you get country of origin. So as a researcher, that's gold. Like I can definitely use that data. So I scraped all the Bitly URLs used in commodity attacks, yanked out all the underlying JSON, and was able to generate this, arguably somewhat pretty map. The total included about 135,000 clicks, so a little bit more than we saw here at Palo Alto Networks. And the regions that were hit most was somewhat interesting as well. We saw a lot in the United States, about 18,000 clicks. India came in second with 12,000. And then we saw about 20 to 25,000 in the Europe region overall. And then Japan and Mexico kind of randomly showed up as well. So this stuff is widespread, but just given this telemetry alone, there's almost like a somewhat targeted feel to it. Like they at least isolated it to certain regions based on what I could tell. Looking at the industries hit, education and high tech topped the list. Manufacturing, healthcare, and then retail sort of tallied up a good chunk as well. And these guys are big on email. Like, if you're trying to defend against this stuff, just look at email, because that's pretty much all they use. They either use widespread spam campaigns or specifically, targeted spear phishing emails, but it's always email. So just, I guess, a heads up there. So let's jump over to targeted stuff. There was about a dozen or so targeted emails that we'd identified. The subjects of them varied somewhat, but typically it always correlated to some recent event. And what you'll notice if you find yourself reading through a number of these is that Pakistan actually shows up quite frequently. You might be wondering why, because we've said earlier, or I've said earlier, that these guys are likely based out of Pakistan. There's a lot of evidence pointing to that fact. So why then is Pakistan showing up so frequently in these subjects? And I can really only speculate there, but given sort of what I've discovered about these guys, I sort of get the impression that they're not super big on their local government. They have a lot of pride in where they're from, but they I think in a lot of cases might disagree with some of the decisions made by their government, so that may or may not play a role here. For example, third bullet from the bottom, how rigging took place in the Senate elections in Pakistan. But yeah, lots of interesting material here, lots of interesting correlations, Pakistan and India, Pakistan and the United States, things of that nature. The targets overall included a pretty wide range. We saw a number of ministries of foreign affairs in various nations being targeted. We saw embassies getting hit. We saw a number of nations overall, United States, Bangladesh, Pakistan, some weird ones, Russia, Australia, Philippines, Brazil. These guys they definitely targeted their attacks, but they didn't seem to have super strong mechanisms in place to say, yeah, we definitely have to only target these ones. They branched out a bit. And the fact that embassies and Ministry of Foreign Affairs were hit may or may not factor into that as well. So Bitly, we get to use Bitly again. About 1,700 clicks. And again, I want to maybe also point out that these clicks may also include security researchers. They may include the attackers themselves. This isn't necessarily isolated to victims only. But what we see is about 500 clicks in Pakistan, 250 or so in the United States, and then Philippines, India, and Russia also finding themselves with a few clicks as well. And given the subject material that we saw earlier, it kind of makes sense. So this is the part where I kind of have to walk the line. And I'm going to be clear, I'm not going to full on dox these people, because that would be kind of a jerk thing to do. But I do want to provide insight into the people behind it. Now, we haven't identified a lot of people, and in fact, there's been some instances where other researchers have been instrumental in the identification as well. Aqib on the right there, for instance, was identified by a group, TUISEC, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. TUISEC, it's an Asian-based security group. They had a nice blog post a few months back where they identified this guy. So this, of course, is not holistic of the entire group. This is really just kind of what we know about so far. We've got Umar. We've got a user named FUD Pages. That's just his moniker. That's not his real name or his real picture. I had to pick something that seemed somewhat appropriate. And then Aqib. So FUD Pages is someone we probably know least about, but he shows up a lot within this cluster of activity that we've labeled Gorgon. And the guy's really into the scene. He's constantly selling and providing various underground services. He's got a web page. I think this is fudpages.com or something. It's not super subtle. But he's just sort of really involved. And it's someone we haven't really tied to a specific identity yet, but person's definitely on our radar. Aqib is an interesting guy as well. Again, I'm not going to full on go into everything. I'm not going to show his Twitter and all that sort of stuff. But I do want to highlight some of the guys' Facebook groups, because I think that really helps paint a picture of who these guys are. So if we look at this guy's Facebook groups, and he's got a lot of them, we can see that he's into hacking, as implied somewhat obviously on the top there. He's into crypto, like cryptocurrency, man of my own heart. And he's real big into like development, like Android. We also see PHP frequently. And then we see a lot of Pakistan-related stuff too. That's a common theme with these guys. You know, they are in a lot of Pakistan, a lot of local groups. It's just something to, I guess, take note of. Umar is somewhat similar. He's a bit more brazen. He's in like a lot of hacking groups, like just obviously so. It's just he hasn't done a lot to lay low. I'll just say that. But yeah, we see some interesting stuff. We see a lot of hacking groups. We see an aviation Army public school, which may or may not ring a bell when you remember that old WHOIS information that we discussed earlier. All Pakistanis. A lot of hacking groups. He's also real big into like the local tech IT scene. He puts on a lot of like gatherings and organizes a lot of meetups and that sort of thing. And just more of the same. Now, one thing I do want to highlight, and this is pure speculation, but I thought it was interesting, is that he is a member of Indian IDs Hacked. Now, you might recall that initial attack used a Indian Yahoo account. And just personally, I just found it really somewhat fascinating and interesting to see that this guy is also part of a Facebook group that is essentially involved in the buying and selling of Indian-specific user accounts. So that was just something that kind of caught my eye. And I guess, you know, because I'm going to wrap up here in just a second, just to sort of wrap up, this is not APT. I'm going to make that perfectly clear. I actually hate that term, but this is not an example of it. This is an example of some kids, you know, in their early 20s who are not from wealthy areas. They're not from, you know, they don't come from a lot of wealth. They feel very strongly in their convictions. They're trying to get by. And this is sort of the culmination of what has happened as a result of that. This threat should by no means be taken lightly. I mean, it's not APT, but this is still a serious threat. I mean, most threats out there are. But it's been some really interesting research. There's been a lot of pivots that I wasn't expecting. There's been a lot of turns and twists that surprised me personally. But overall, it's been sort of a fun ride, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it as well. A few references in case folks wanted to learn more about it. Again, some similar posts. TUISEC 360 also did a nice blog, number 5 and 6 there. They're in Chinese, so Google Translate your friend on that one, but unless you speak Chinese. But yes, with that, I'm going to wrap things up. What I got to like 10:30? Dave left. Oh, there he is. I'm good? All right. With that, I guess I will open up to questions if folks have any. Yeah, so the question is, while you're looking at... Sure, that's a great question. So the question was, you know, while I'm researching this, am I looking at the current geopolitical events going on at the same time? And I believe the other question was sort of, how do I know this is a real person versus just some fake persona? And that's a great question. I didn't jump into all the evidence. To answer your second question first, I didn't jump into all the evidence, but there is, at least in the case of Umar, very, very strong evidence that this person exists. We've identified like a lot around this guy, and with respect, I just don't feel like this guy is sophisticated enough to go to such efforts to create this persona. While that is always a possibility, though, in this case, my personal opinion is that it is a real person. As for the geopolitical events, I try to keep up as best I can, but I am in no way, shape, or form an expert. I'm not a political science major. I'm just a malware guy, so I certainly do my best, but I have limitations just like everyone else. So the question, I guess, is, can I say with certainty that he doesn't have a wealthy background? I feel like I can. I can explain that to you better when I'm not being videotaped. So I guess for the rest of the audience, just maybe trust me on that one. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was if he had used a VPS instead of a home router, would that have affected the investigation? Certainly. That makes things oftentimes much more difficult. In this particular case, though, as we discovered, the majority of the interesting stuff actually came from the subat.com domain itself, though. So while that would have made things more difficult, we still would have, in this case, got some good info out of it. Yes, in the front. So the question was, with the amount of compromised home routers, how do I know that it was his? I believe it was his. I don't have concrete evidence that it was, but there's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that it likely was. And as we saw, I mean, yeah, I guess it's possible this guy might be like a neighbor and the guy's got Wi-Fi and he like got access to it and then just used that. But even in that situation, in that hypothetical, he would still be sort of a neighbor. He would still be in pretty much that direct vicinity. Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of evidence pointing to that fact, pointing to that conclusion. I think they're, yeah, right in the middle. Yeah, how did I land on the name Gorgon? My bosses picked it. No, we try to stick with like a monster that wouldn't get us sued by Disney. So Gorgon is like what Medusa is. It's like a snake lady, snake hair lady. I don't have a good answer for you. It just seems somewhat, you know, like a lot of heads, like a lot of stuff going on. I don't know. We just threw it out there. Yeah.
When you had this elementary stuff, one of your slides, the massive spike in March or May.
Yes.
Comment about that?
Yes, there's a big spike in March or May. I don't know if I've actually dug into that fully, but I suspect it was just a big spam campaign they'd conducted in that period. I could probably find out for you. I can give you my card later. And yeah. Maybe one more question? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the question is sort of, you know, how do I mask my identity as I'm doing this research? Presenting at conferences that are videotaped is probably not the best idea. But in your specific example, you know, knocking on his home router, just through the use of proxies and VPSs myself, I mean, as researchers, we have to employ, in a lot of cases, the same techniques as the bad guys to sort of hide our identities as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up because I want to make sure the next speaker has enough time to set up, because that's always like the worst when you're like, it's my time to go, I got to go. So I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you for your time. It was a lot of fun, and thank you. All right, thanks.